For number 19, we see our LCD is v squared, and that would mean that our only restrictions would be that v is not allowed to be equal to 0. So when we multiply both sides by v squared cancels, we get 4. Here, v squared times 1 is v squared, and then this v squared cancels, so we get plus v minus 2. When we get a situation like this, we see we have a quadratic equation, and when we have a quadratic equation with all three terms, meaning quadratic, linear, and constant, we gather all the terms to one side, we set one side equal to 0, and we have multiple ways to solve this. Oops, can't factor out a v, but we can, though, factor this polynomial by using the FOIL method. So 3 times 2 is 6. Positive 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, but positive 3 minus 2 is positive 1. So we see that v equals 2 and v equals negative 3 would be the solutions to that equation. And they are not the restrictions. Here we can see in number 20 that the LCD is doing the restrictions there. The LCD is n squared, n times n. All three of these denominators divide evenly into n squared, and we see the restriction is n is not allowed to be 0. Oops, there we go. So multiplying both sides by n squared, this n cancels with one of those n's, and so we get n, we're left with a factor of n multiplied by this numerator of 5n plus 10, and then we have minus this n squared cancels with the LCD, and so we have to subtract, be really careful here, subtract the entire numerator n plus 5, and then equals this n squared cancels with the LCD, so we're left with 1 times n minus 1. So we have to get rid of these parentheses, so we're going to distribute the n here, and we get n times 5n is 5n squared. N times 10 is 10n. Don't forget to distribute this minus sign. It's like a negative 1 times all this. So negative 1 times n is negative n. Negative 1 times positive 5 is negative 5 equals n minus 1. Once students get to this point here, they're almost home free, but really distributing that minus 1 there is the key to this problem. Now, we can see we have a quadratic term, we have linear term, we have constant term. So we have a quadratic equation, and we want to gather all the terms to one side. So we're going to go ahead and subtract. You know what? Before we do that, we're going to combine like terms here on the left-hand side. We're going to get 5n squared plus 10n minus 1n is 9n. And then we have a minus 5. And on the right-hand side, we have an n minus 1. That's when we want to go ahead and subtract n from both sides. And I'll line up the terms that are alike, so it'll be easier to add up. We're also going to add 1 to both sides. So again, lining up the terms that are alike. So we have 5n squared plus 0, 5n squared, plus 9n minus 1n is plus 8n, and then negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4 equals 0. So at this point, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to look at the solutions, and the solutions are 2/5 and negative 2. So the reason why I'm doing this is this. If these solutions involve radicals, I know that this is not going to factor. But the first thing I'm going to try to do is factor, and if this were a test, I wasn't able to look at the answers, I would first try to factor. But in creating an answer key here and some video solutions, I didn't want to go through the hassle of trying to factor it if it didn't factor. But if I see rational numbers over here, I know that I'm not going to get any radicals. That means it definitely will factor. And so, get a little practice factoring here, and the factors of 5n squared would be 5n and n, and the factors of 4 would be either 2 and 2 or 4 and 1, but again, I can cheat a little bit and look over here. I'm going to have 2's in there, so I need to have a 2 and a 2, and those would be always the factors I would try anyway. If I'm factoring 4, the first factors I'm going to try are the ones that are closest together. So the 2 and the 2, I'm going to try those anyway first. And then I'm going to look at my outside. So 10n and 2n, I can make 8n from that if the 2 is positive, and this 2 over here is positive, and this 2 over here is negative. So again, 5n times 2 is 10n. So I can visualize this. and then we have a minus 2n. Well, that's going to give me 8n. So I've got both factors correct, and then if I set each factor equal to 0, I get 5n minus 2 is 0, which means we add 2 to both sides, and we divide by 5, so we get n equals 2/5. Here, n plus 2 equals 0, so we get n equals negative 2, and that's exactly what we see that the answers that we talked about the answers were going to be. So again, neither of these numbers are the restrictions that we listed earlier, and so we're done with that problem.